In this edition of Tank vs Tank, we go back to January 1981.
On one side, the Chieftain main battle tank, heavily armoured with a powerful gun. This was the British Army's main battle tank for 30 years. On the other side, the Soviet T-62. It's lighter and faster than the Chieftain main battle tank. It's still in service now, but arguably lacks the sophistication of contemporary Western main battle tanks.
These tanks were designed to go up against each other in Europe in a NATO versus Warsaw Pact scenario.
That never happened. Instead, they would face off against each other in the Middle East during the war between Iran and Iraq. In this Tank vs Tank, we'll see how tactics and deployment can completely neutralise the strengths of one vehicle, even if it has the edge on paper. If you've ever wondered how one tank would perform against another, there are few better places to satisfy your curiosity than in the vast battle maps of World of Tanks. With over 600 vehicles from 11 different nations, World of Tanks allows you to master the tactics of tank warfare. It's free to play, and new players can sign up today and support the Tank Museum using the link and invite code in the description below. And now, back to the video.
My name is Paul Famigura and I'm a content creator here at the Tank Museum. I've worked here for almost 6 years, and most of that time was as a guide, delivering tours to different people, from visitors to members of the military. But enough about me, let's get back to the tanks.
The Chieftain and the T-62 are Cold War contemporaries, from a time when hostility between East and West was at its peak. These two very different tanks were built to match the very different military ethos of two opposing European armies for a war that never happened.
The British-built Chieftain entered service in the early 60s, in line with the British main battle tank concept, and with the Chieftain the emphasis was on firepower and protection. It was designed for a defensive war against the Soviets if they were ever going to invade the rest of Europe. Weighing 55 tons with armour up to 280mm thick on its cast turret, it was at the time one of the most heavily armoured tanks in existence. The T-62 had a design emphasis on mobility and the capacity for mass production. When threatened, they intend to use aggression, speed, and the weight of their numbers to overpower their Western enemies. From the crew's perspective, the T-62 and its cramped fighting compartment is definitely less desirable compared to the Chieftains, and this was one of a number of compromises the designers had to make at the expense of crew comfort and perhaps the confidence of the crew itself. Maximum armour thickness is 230mm, which is generally thinner than the Western main battle tanks. But this makes it much lighter. At only 37 tons, it weighs 18 tons less than the Chieftain and is much more agile. The 115mm ammunition was also pretty hefty, especially in such an enclosed space. To prevent empty shell casings from taking up that space, the T-62 has an auto shell ejection system to prevent clutter.
It's powered by the T55 V12-cylinder diesel, which is a development of the excellent Kharkov V2, which powered the T-34. This too is a rugged and reliable engine that gives the T-62 a speed of about 31 miles per hour.
Here inside the Chieftain, it's an entirely different story. It's a lot more ergonomic and well thought out, and the main gun is using 3-piece ammunition. This involves loading the projectile separately first into the breech, followed by the bag charge, which contains your propellant. The third piece of ammunition is this right here, the vent tube, which goes at the bottom of the breech. When the gunner or the commander fire the main gun, one of these shell casings is fired off, detonating the bag charge and sending the projectile out the barrel. And when the loader opens up the breech, they're ready to load the next round straight away. The reputation of the Chieftain's Leyland L60 multi-fuel engine is a lot less positive. It's a relatively powerful engine but has a poor power-to-weight ratio, but it can get the Chieftain up to about 25 miles per hour. With it being a multi-fuel engine, it was designed to run on petrol, diesel, and even aviation fuel, which would have been perfect during wartime when logistics are stretched. Pretty much anyone who served or worked on the Chieftain will be familiar with this very common phrase. The Chieftain was a great tank, as long as it broke down in a good firing position.
Initially at least, it suffered from a range of reliability issues and general maintenance headaches resulting from poor build quality. These were resolved with later upgrades, but it's fair to say that the earlier versions were pretty poor. But by 1981, they were as reliable as anything else on the battlefield.
The party piece on the Chieftain is this, the L11 120mm rifled gun. which at the time was probably one of the best tank guns of all. It still holds the world record for the longest recorded tank kill. Admittedly, this was achieved whilst mounted in a Challenger 1 tank in 1991, but the gun was developed and used first on the Chieftain.
An APDS round fired from the L11 has a muzzle velocity of 1,370 meters per second and will penetrate 355 millimeters of vertical armor at 1,000 meters. That's quite a punch.
The T-62 is equipped with a 115mm smoothbore gun. Quite the innovation, as this was the first production tank to be fitted with one.
Smoothbore is considered better for firing fin rounds because the spin produced by rifled barrels tends to make the fin round lose velocity and therefore hitting power. But even so, the 115mm fin round has a muzzle velocity of 1,600 meters per second and will penetrate 228mm of vertical armor at 1,000 meters, making it less deadly than the Chieftain at this range, but importantly, it's capable of penetrating the Chieftain's armor at closer ranges.
So, on paper, the Chieftain wins in firepower and protection. The T-62 wins in terms of mobility and is arguably more reliable. With 2 out of the 3, surely the Chieftain would be the favourite when going up against the T-62. But battles don't happen on paper.
In fact, from a commander's perspective, they often happen at the worst possible place and at the worst possible time, where plenty of other variables can influence the outcome. And that's exactly how it went down when Iranian-operated Chieftain tanks met Iraqi-operated T-62s in battle on January 5, 1981. The previous year, Saddam Hussein led Iraq in an invasion of its neighbour Iran, putting the T-62 up against the Chieftain, which, unlike its adversary, had yet to be tested in combat, even by the British. Iraq had purchased about 700 of the 5,000 or so T-62s that were exported to various nations. And before the Shah was overthrown by a revolution in 1979, Iran was one of 6 nations to buy British, acquiring 700 Chieftain Mark IIIs and Mark Vs. Now, in January 1981, the Iranians are mounting their first counter-offensive.
The objective is to lift the siege on the city of Abadan and force the Iraqi army back towards their border. But they're about to instigate the biggest tank battle since Kursk 1943.
Following the revolution, the Iranian army has been purged of officers, leaving them desperately short of experienced and competent commanders. Morale is low. Following a short artillery bombardment, which includes around 200 Chieftains and 100 US M60 Pattons, the Iranians crossed the river Kirkuk by pontoon bridge.
But the ground is marshy and it's the wet season, so the Chieftains are forced to deploy on the only viable route, an exposed road, which puts them at a huge disadvantage.
Slow progress across the river gives Iraqi air recon plenty of time to detect and anticipate the movements of this force, and they move to intercept by feigning withdrawal and setting up an ambush. With a brigade of tanks dug in hold-down positions across the road, the Iraqi T-62s wait for the column of Iranian Chieftain tanks to appear. The Iranian forces are roughly 3 times as large as the Iraqi forces. Sure enough, having failed to effectively recon their route, the Iranian Chieftains blunder straight into the trap. Firing at close ranges from their prepared positions, the T-62s are able to inflict heavy casualties on the Iranian column, whilst proving hard to hit themselves. Many Iranian crews also haven't turned on their gun stabilizers. In their attempt to fight back, some of the Chieftains begin to awkwardly maneuver off the exposed road and into marshy ground. A poor power-to-weight ratio makes them agonizingly slow over this terrain, and a number soon become bogged down and abandoned by their demoralized crews. With their gearboxes being strenuously tested as drivers desperately try to position their tanks in reasonable firing positions, a number of these unreliable and poorly maintained tanks start to fail, whilst others are picked off as they slowly relocate.
In contrast, the lighter T-62s can successfully maneuver around the same sort of ground. They flank the Chieftain main battle tanks and inflict heavy losses. The Iranian commanders issue a withdrawal.
It's a costly defeat for the Iranians. Estimates vary, but losses are put at 100 tanks destroyed and upwards of 150 captured. The Iraqis have lost between 80 to 130 tanks in total.
This tank versus tank episode serves as an interesting example in which the combatant vehicles were being used in the exact opposite ways to each other, and they also went against each other in a part of the world where it was never envisioned. On one side, the Chieftains are required to manoeuvre on the offensive against largely static and defensively positioned T-62s.
It also reminds us of how flawed command decisions can undermine the value of available assets.
So whilst the T-62 performed superior in this engagement, the failure of the Iranians can't entirely be pinned on the poor performance of the Chieftain. Although the battle did raise some uncomfortable home truths for the British observers about their current main battle tank.
By the early 1980s, the UK enjoyed a good relationship with the regime in Iraq, which allowed them to assess the Chieftain tanks recovered from the battlefield. These were the subject of a report that acknowledged that the tanks had not been used in the role for which they were designed, and that most losses were a result of them being abandoned before they were knocked out. It was also critical of how the Iranian crews handled the Chieftains in battle, and how they were maintained. But there were also alarming observations about the performance of the armour, arguably the Chieftain's key strength when fighting at such close range.
The Iraqi Army Corps Chief of Staff said in a post-war interview that Iraqi Sabah rounds went straight through the front of the Chieftain, straight out of the backside, which was supported by the analysis of the knocked-out vehicles. It was also reported that any shots to the side of the turret would have been catastrophic.
The report prompted the installation of the Stillbrew armour package on the British Chieftain tanks to offer more frontal protection against the contemporary Soviet threat encountered during the battle. So although the Chieftain tanks performed poorly in Iran, it was an opportunity to examine its vulnerabilities and improve on them.
The Tank Museum has a number of different types of Chieftain, and this one here is a Mark V, very similar to the type used by the Iranian forces in 1981. And if you'd like to find out more, consider checking out this tank chat. Our T-62 was captured by British forces in Iraq in 1991 during the First Gulf War, and its age suggests that it might have even taken part in the Iran-Iraq War in the 80s. If you'd like to find out more, check out our full tank chat. What tank versus tank would you like to see me cover in the future? Leave your suggestions below in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing.
We'd like to say thanks to World of Tanks for not only sponsoring this video, but also for providing us with footage to help illustrate the narrative in this video. The T-62 represented in the footage is a T-62A, a medium tank which boasts great manoeuvrability and protection. Whilst its 100mm main gun has a fast reload and aim time, its below average damage and low gun depression make it ideal for hit and run tactics. The Chieftain represented in this footage is an FV4201 Chieftain prototype, a heavy tank with fantastic firepower but less than ideal armour, which will force players to be more tactical when using this heavy beast. New players can sign up now using the link and invite code below.